So we will start. Just nod with your head so I can see that you can all hear me. Good. So good evening from Israel, everyone. My name is Carol Nuriel, and I'm the director of ADL in Israel. I'd like to welcome all of our participants on Zoom and those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live. It's great to have all of you here for our fifth, and actually I would say the last webinar in a series of webinars that we have been holding jointly with our dear partners, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Israel. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our friends Alexander Brakel, head of the foundation in Israel, and Palina Kedem for this great partnership. In the last couple of months, we have created together a platform for in-depth conversations on various aspects of fighting hate during the COVID-19 pandemic and some related issues. And unfortunately, hate really increased during the pandemic. So thank you again. I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Alexander Brakel, head of the foundation in Israel, to open the panel. Alexander, please.
Thank you very much. And very warm welcome to all of you joining us tonight. Before I start, I want to give back the words of thanks from our behalf, on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation Israel, to our dear partners at the Anti-Defamation League Israel. I cannot stress enough that the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, as a German institute operating abroad, can do our work only in close collaboration with our dear partners, and thanks to their enormous insights in the matters that we tackle together. So I'm very happy about what hopefully was only the beginning of a long-term partnership, and I think that we did the best out, or made the best out of this dire circumstances, and that in the near future we'll have the opportunity to continue our cooperation, including with in-person events. Having said that, I'm very happy that we managed to close this year's series of events with tonight's topic, which probably is not the most pressing topics inside the framework of the discussion about anti-Semitism, but the one most controversially discussed in many countries, including my own country, including Germany. Because without any doubt, there is something like Israel-related anti-Semitism, and without any doubt, many ardent anti-Semites camouflage their anti-Semitism by criticizing the only Jewish state in the world. On the other hand, it equally goes without saying that at least sometimes the label anti-Semitism is being used to deflect legitimate criticism of Israel. And as we are dealing with the high good of the freedom of speech, this is something that we should be concerned about too. And there's another aspect that I really want to stress, because it's very pressing in Germany right now. And that's the fact that a light-hearted, let's say, label of anti-Semitism might be enough to poison the whole discourse about Israel. This is something that we've seen in Germany right now, that you have more and more people, including politicians, who tell me that they better stay away from the political topic of Israel because it's become too toxic. And for us, for the Adenauer in Israel, who basically want to do whatever we can to strengthen the ties between Germany and Israel, a toxic dialogue is the last thing we need. We all understand that today's topic is a very heavy one, and that there are probably no clear-cut answers. So I think the only thing that we can do is to use this opportunity to think more and think deeper about the boundaries and the clear-cut and blurred boundaries alike between anti-Semitism, legitimate criticism of Israel. And I think if we all do that in trustworthy spirit, will already contribute a lot to a less toxic dialogue that in the end will help fighting anti-Semitism. So I'm really excited about this evening. I'm really looking forward to listening to our speakers, and with that, I'll hand over the microphone to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I'd like to give now a brief introduction to the topic, and then we will hear from our speakers. I just want to say that if you have any questions, please email them to my colleague, Michal Ben-Shitrit, at michalb@adl.org. I'll say it again, michalb@adl.org, and we will try to answer them as much as time allows. So I've been with ADL for over 18 years, and I think that the question that I've been dealing with the most over the years has been, where do we draw the line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism? But as realities on the ground changed, as well as trends in the global discourse and the one specifically related to Jews in Israel, this question has evolved, and the truth is that there's no simple answer to that. This is a question that the professional community keeps dealing with, and the way Israel fits into the conversation on anti-Semitism is really the heart of the matter here. As one way to deal with it and to try to set the boundaries for this conversation, the IRA definition for anti-Semitism has changed a couple of years ago to include some manifestations of modern anti-Semitism. The IRA definition offers a broad, including, and most importantly, non-binding working definition covering classical and current displays of anti-Semitism, including when criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitic. But this definition also still allows for protected political expression on Israel and Zionism, and that's very, very important. ADL, as an organization which its primary mission is to fight anti-Semitism, is dealing with this question constantly, and I think that as the discourse changes, we have to adopt a multi-layered approach that takes into account issues of intention, motivation, and how a specific expression, even if not anti-Semitic per se, can create a fertile ground for an anti-Semitic discourse, and how we should address that. We have with us today three distinguished panelists representing three different points of view. One from Israel, one from the US, and one bridging between the two of them. Allow me to present Dr. Batya Ungar-Sargon, opinion editor at The Forward, Nadav Eyal, chief international correspondent at Reshet News, and Dr. Tomer Persiko-Koret, visiting assistant professor of Jewish and Israel Studies, Department of Near Eastern Studies, Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, Center for Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley, and a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Nadav has notified us that he needs to leave at 6:40, so we will make sure that to hear from you before Nadav. So I'd like to start with a similar question to all of you, and from your perspectives. So understanding when anti-Israel expressions cross the line into anti-Semitism is complex, and there's a pretty wide spectrum for that. We all know some who consider any criticism of Israel to be rooted in anti-Semitism, whereas others claim any labeling of anti-Israel expression as anti-Jewish is wrong and an effort to shut down legitimate criticism of Israel. So where do you draw the line? Batya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel truly humbled to have been invited to participate in this conversation. And thank you also for those sobering opening remarks. I think for American Jews who feel the cause of the Palestinians very urgently, but who also want to feel safe, I and others, I think we really resent the idea that there's a sort of tension between Jews being safe and Palestinians having civil rights. And that's sort of what happens when the activism and the water gets muddied with anti-Semitism. So I do think this is a really important topic. I want to start by saying something that I think might be a little bit unpopular, but Israelis, I think, really struggle to understand anti-Semitism. And I think that you see this in sort of two ways. On the one hand, one often hears Israelis speaking in a way that sounds like they think that criticism of Israel or criticism of them as Jews is anti-Semitic. And then on the other hand, something else I've noticed is that you'll often hear Israelis sort of falling into anti-Semitic tropes, like when they're talking about Israel, about AIPAC, for example, like you'll hear Israelis sort of speaking about it in a kind of like nudge, nudge, wink, wink way. That's kind of like, you know, falling into the same traps as people who speak in an anti-Semitic way. And I'm generalizing, obviously, but this is something that I have noticed often. And it's led me to sort of question why that is. Why do Israelis struggle to understand anti-Semitism? And the answer that I've come up with is that, you know, the problem with anti-Semitism is not that they hate Jews, and it's not that, you know, they even killed Jews. It's that for thousands of years they hated and killed Jews and there was no one to defend us. It was that we existed in this defenseless position where their hatred and their ability to harm us and take away our rights happened with no one to stand up for us and no one to defend us. And that is simply not the case for Israelis, right? You have the 17th strongest military in the world. And that matters. That changes something. You live in a sovereign state. And so that is not to say that you cannot be attacked by anti-Semites. Right? It's quite clear that Hamas is quite anti-Semitic, right? I don't think any of us would disagree with that. But the status of being attacked, even by an anti-Semite, against a sovereign state is simply different. Whereas we still live here, okay? We are still in the diaspora. We are still subject to the kinds of anti-Semitism that have plagued Jews. And that is something that I think Israelis, by and large, have zero humility when coming to this topic. So I wanted to start with that. So how do you actually judge when something is criticism of Israel, when something is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is a hatred of Jews that has a grammar, right? Like it's a conspiracy theory, and as such, it has its own language. It has its own method of expression that has been carefully honed by the people who hate us for the last 2,000 years. And actually, an Israeli named Shani Moore came up with a really good summary of what that grammar is. You know it when you see it because it often has three things: a conspiracy theory about Jewish power, Jewish money, and blood, right? Those are the three components. When you see those things, you know, either Jews using their power to secretly manipulate things, Jews using their money, or Jews committing massacres, those are the building blocks of anti-Semitism. So take BDS. You can have expressions of BDS that do not have those things, and you can have expressions of BDS that do have those things. So is BDS anti-Semitic? It depends. You know, is it based on the grammar of Jewish blood, Jews spilling blood of innocents, Jewish money, and Jewish power, Jews secretly using their power to silence critics, you know, or do other things, manipulate foreign governments? Or is it not? Is it simply an expression of frustration against a sovereign nation with the 17th strongest army in the world? So that's how I would say I draw the line. I look for those building blocks. I look to see, is it using the time-honed language of anti-Semitism? And that's how I judge.
Thank you very much, Batya. And Nadav, I would like to turn to you. Are the Israelis really drawing the line closer, as Batya just referred to? Is there a tendency in Israel to label anti-Israel expressions as anti-Semitic automatically?
Well, I think so, and I suspect that I don't think that me, Tomer, or Batya are going to have a lot of divisions during this conversation, at least on this subject. I think that Israel has a tendency to take every legitimate criticism of Israel and at least check if it's not anti-Semitic. So it begins with a sort of a first kind of a testing for it, and then you know, surely enough, you'll have the politicians who will try to use this and to define criticism of Israel as being anti-Semitic. I totally agree with what Batya said about Israelis not understanding fully anti-Semitism. We are a majority group in Israel. The fact that Israelis, many of them are descendants of Holocaust survivors, the fact that they are descendants of communities that have been oppressed in Arab countries, or in North African countries doesn't mean that this somehow transcends genetically. The understanding that you are a majority group is more essential than anything else. And most Israelis are born into a situation of security. They are not a minority. I'm talking about Jewish Israelis, of course. And they simply have trouble relating to minorities, as majority groups do, not because they are specifically Israelis, but because they have been born to this privilege. And I think that one of the problems I have as a journalist is, for instance, explaining to Israelis that when either the American diaspora or the Austrian diaspora is basically labeling this politician and saying he's dog whistling, we understand this coded language, and this coded language is actually anti-Semitism, I get a lot of response from Israelis saying, well, what he said is not anti-Semitic. Why would you go so far? And I've seen this both with right-wing politicians from the Freedom Party, and for instance, when I wrote stuff about Jeremy Corbyn and the way that he essentially disregarded, and then to a large extent, I think even more than disregarded, sort of had his own fully grown strain of left-wing anti-Semitism growing in the Labour Party, and people would say, well, we don't understand, why would this be counted as anti-Semitism at all? They didn't understand the left wing here, or the radical left wing in Israel, the Jewish radical left wing did not understand the Jewish community in the UK, and the right wing here didn't understand the Austrian Jewish community, referring to Austrian right-wing politicians. So we're seeing this all across the board, and I do agree. On the other hand, I think that when you do sense a very specific sense of what we label new anti-Semitism, it's then that things become much more complicated. It will be easy enough just to take, to say if you don't have sort of iconic blood rituals and you don't have money, it won't be anti-Semitic. But how do you react, for instance, to the idea that Jews are just a religion and are not a people, are not a nation, and therefore they do not have the right of national self-determination? And this right is actually a post-colonialist invention of some sort of a settler colonialism invented by Western thought in the late 19th century. And therefore, the whole Jewish existence on a national level as Israel or as Zionism is therefore only some sort of a hollow construct, which is a tool of oppression against an indigenous people. And Jews do not have this right of national self-determination at all. Then we border on something that is much more complex, and to handle this, I was examined on these issues in the LSE. So I took tests and exams, which I passed, about describe Zionism as settler colonialism. Okay, so that was a class that I took. Is this legitimate? Of course, in terms of academically speaking, you might argue that treating Zionism as settler colonialism is something that might be helpful in talking about Zionism. I don't agree. I also think that it's not, and there's no empire behind it. But then they will say, oh, there is an empire. There is, for instance, the international, Jewry. They won't say it this way because this will turn them immediately into anti-Semites. And then that's the conversation you have with Marxists, or with what I would label anti-Semite Marxists all the time. So this is where it becomes much more complex. I know many Jewish students, which when they hear the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they would immediately say that this is a slogan talking about genocide. Well, when I talk with my Palestinian friends, they say free from, free for everyone, free for also for the Jews, free in a one-state solution. So then it becomes really complex. What's sure is that when we use this kind of labeling and slogans, and when we single out criticism as anti-Semitic, we are mainly not being effective in actually tackling it. So the question is, what do we want to do? Do we want to say this is illegitimate? I'm not willing to hear this, and I don't want it to be heard anywhere. Or do we want to win the argument? And these are two different things, because sometimes, you might say, I don't want to have this argument at all. And I know the ADL, keeps asking these questions all the time. I don't want this argument to actually happen because it's illegitimate. Or do we think that we actually need to convince people? And that's a completely different thing. And I did at the time a series of short documentaries about the BDS, about anti-Semitism in Europe. It was in 2014, 2015. And then we aired it as a documentary also in the US. And basically, one chapter dealt with BDS, and it was asking, is BDS naturally anti-Semitic? And my answer on mainstream popular TV broadcast channel was no, it's not. It doesn't. It can be anti-Semitic, and I've shown the examples of people in a demonstration being basically anti-Semitic with me, saying Jews have a problem with. But it doesn't necessarily, you can divest or boycott countries without being a racist from political reasons. And I have to say that Israelis didn't go, oh my God, he said that on broadcast channel, let's fire him. He's an anti-Semite himself. So Israelis went, yeah, well, we can discuss it. So sometimes the protagonists of Israel and its leaders, they give an impression of something that is much more wider than it is in our public discussion, I think.
Thank you, Nadav. Before I move on to Tomer, I do want to say that in addition to what Batya mentioned, the criteria that Batya mentioned, and Nadav, you mentioned the anti-Zionist perspective. So I do want to say that there's also this notion of ignoring the historic connection between Israel and its historic homeland, which is also one of the features of anti-Zionism. And the question is how we relate to it. So we as an organization really, really oppose that. And that's a very problematic statement that most of the time we deem anti-Semitic or creating a fertile ground for anti-Semitism. And also the expression from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So yes, if you read that literally, that does not mean necessarily the annihilation of the Jewish people and its state, but still it has become a phrase that is really accepted as a very problematic one in many circles. Tomer, to you, so we spoke about the sense of majority in Israel, you're an Israeli, and then the sense of being a minority among diaspora Jewry. Many times they are attacked, diaspora Jews, for automatically what they are perceived as being automatically identified with the state of Israel. How do you see it from there? Give us a perspective of an Israeli in a US campus, please.
Thank you, Carol. Let me begin with a story. April 2019, so it's a year and a half ago, and a group of students here at UC Berkeley are shouted out of a meeting of the student council. And basically, these are Jewish students. They are blamed for being Zionists, and as such, for allowing apartheid and indeed genocide in the West Bank, and they're not allowed to speak. Now, this meeting was not about any political issue at all. And these attacks on these students, some of them my students, were unprovoked, out of context completely. Question is this anti-Semitism? Now, I think it probably is, but I think we need to understand how it is. Obviously, there is a generalization about Jews being Zionist. There is by the way, probably some of them aren't. There is a direct connecting of them to the state of Israel, which we don't find with students from other, let's say, problematic states, an easy example is China. But what makes it anti-Semitism? So let me give you my working definition of anti-Semitism, and it has to do with a deep-seated hatred, I think, for Jewishness more than for Jews. It often gets translated into a hatred for Jews and indeed violence towards Jews, but it's more a hatred of Jewishness that comes out of a rivalry between the Christian West and Judaism. Judaism as the emblematic other of the Christian West, and indeed as a sort of an older sister religion that needs to be denounced and rejected in order to assert self-authority and self-definition. So Judaism is trying to be attempted to be erased in order for the younger sister civilization to prosper. I think this is classical anti-Semitism, and what we have today, though, especially among left-wing intelligentsia, is something a bit different. It is still a hatred of Jewishness, but this time the emblematic other has become the emblematic father, I would say. Judaism is the origin of Western sin, the origin of patriarchy, the origin of hierarchy, the origin of exclusivity, the origin of colonialism, the origin of racism. And here there is an attempt again to erase Jewishness, but this time not as an other, as a competing sibling rival, but as a sort of, and forgive my Freudianism for a minute, as a sort of Oedipal attempt to kill the sinful father and thus to cleanse ourselves from our original sin. And if we take anti-Semitism as that, we can now complicate the matters and understand, I think, a bit better how some expressions of bias against Judaism or Jews or the state of Israel are anti-Semitic, and some are simply biased, because there is other sorts of bias and racism even that are not anti-Semitic. I would say that, returning to the story I began with, that sort of attack on unsuspecting, unprovoking students for being Zionist and complicit in genocide and whatever is anti-Semitism, because it is contemporary left-wing, radical left-wing anti-Semitism that attempts, again, as I said, to cleanse the West from this presence of colonial essence, right? These Jews, these students, simply for being Jews, were blamed for bringing into, the atmosphere, the scene of the student council meeting, their essence of colonialism or apartheid or what have you, being in a very far removed way connected to Israel. So if that is the case, then we also can understand that some expressions critical of Israel are not anti-Semitic. And obviously, to say the very obvious, there is good reason to criticize Israel politically and socially, as we all know. I mean, Israelis do it all the time. And obviously not all sorts of anti-Zionism are anti-Semitism. And if only to give a very easy example, for Hasidic courts such as Satmar or Neturei Karta or Chabad, even the Lubavitcher Hasidic court are anti-Zionist, but obviously they're not anti-Semite. So it always has to be contextualized and really a bit researched to see where it comes from. I want to say one more thing about, and this is about the politicization of anti-Semitism, and here by the Israeli government. I think it should be obvious that the Israeli government, the Israeli right-wing government that has been in power for the last 10 years at least, has a vested interest in blowing up anti-Semitism or the image of anti-Semitism, and really labeling any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. And we've seen this happen, and we've seen this happen in a criticism of Israel, of what Israel is doing in the West Bank and the occupied territories. And we've seen this in other points of criticism. And this is wrong for two reasons. First of all, it's simply hypocritical, and this is why, because I remind you, this is why the Israeli government has no problem associating with right-wing bigots and racists that are also forwarding anti-Semitic tropes in Eastern Europe, such as Hungary and Poland. It's hypocritical because Israeli government, and this is my memory, correct me if I'm wrong, took 3 days to condemn the anti-Semitic neo-Nazis in the Charlottesville march that they had. 3 days it took them, when they are tweeting out condemnations of criticism of the Israeli occupation in the West Bank in a matter of a quarter of an hour. When that happens, and so that's, and so we need to notice that, and the second and even more important point is that when you allow or when you use criticism of Israel's occupation as an anti-Semitic trope, when you condemn it as anti-Semitism, you are basically playing into the hands of actual anti-Semites. Because if every condemnation of the occupation is anti-Semitic, that basically equates the occupation with the state of Israel, with the actual existence of a Jewish state. And if that's an equation, then it's a lot easier for actual anti-Semites to criticize Israel, because whether that criticism is legitimate or not, it's anyway always blamed as anti-Semitic, and then you can actually cut under the legitimate existence of an independent state for the Jewish people. Thank you, that's for now.
Thank you very much, Tomer. And actually, your comments are a great opening for the next question that I have. We're going to talk about governments, but I do want to say that it's fair to say that, as much as I totally agree with you that the politicization of anti-Semitism is a very problematic one. And you know what, we should treat that as hatred and deal with it as hatred wherever it comes from. It's fair to say that Israel has its own political and geopolitical interests, and it keeps that in many ways. But let's move to other governments. So ADL's challenge along the years has been to educate and advocate with governments that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. We always used to say, we also had a campaign, anti-Semitism is anti-all of us, meaning that anti-Semitism not only hurts the Jewish community, but also the society in which it exists. So as such, it is for the governments to be directly responsible for fighting anti-Semitism and not delegated to other groups. But with regards to criticism of Israel, should we draw a different line? In recent years, parliaments and also statements took clear positions against anti-Israeli or anti-Zionist expressions. Just recent examples of French President Emmanuel Macron, who equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, the Bundestag decision to ban BDS, Trump's executive order, and so on. So I want to ask Nadav, is it helpful or counterproductive? I mean, the concerns of free speech and so on.
I think that I think it's helpful in the sense that if you mean what's happening in social networks, which I think you do, I think that
more on the government level, but please.
Sorry, yeah.
More on the government levels, how governments really, set the boundaries of that conversation. But please.
Yeah, well, we just had this discussion in Israel, which is a sort of reminiscent of the anti-Semitism discussion about Facebook not taking down anti-vaxxers groups on its platform, and then the Ministry of Justice had to inform Facebook about these groups, which of course Facebook knows all about. Then they took some groups out. Okay, so what we see here is that when socially there is an expectation that Facebook will start cleaning the way it conducts itself, then politicians or even bureaucrats, they go into this arena that was built by public discussion and by themselves, sometimes by social networks, going to Congress saying we're going to do it, or making these announcements. So I don't think that there is a firm sort of divide between these things. Generally speaking, in terms of freedom of speech, I am not from those who say, oh, they'll go to a different network, they'll find different avenues. And also, if we look at research, maybe Tomer could speak about this more thoroughly, we know that taking stuff down really helps. It would take time for other platforms to be built. It would take time to conduct ourselves and to have platforms which will have enough large audience. And because of this, I think that firm action against hate speech, and for that matter also against other forms of dangerous fake news, is really essential. It's the lessons that we have learned in the last few years. And I think there's a growing consensus about that also in the tech industry. But since they are not doing the job as I remember meeting, people from tech giants in 2017, just after President Trump was elected, and they were shocked and they were depressed and they were promising they're going to tackle it, and they were explaining they can't do this through AI, so they're going to do it with human beings. And we saw those movies about the people who actually need to do it, and they didn't do it. They didn't do it because basically they don't want to become a publisher. They don't want the responsibilities that we have in TV, in newspapers, because they know that legally this will attain them to a legal responsibility they really don't want to have. And this is not going to go away. And what's going to happen is that governments like Germany has, and Israel and many others are going to go into this arena whether we want them or whether we don't. And it's dangerous. It's a dangerous game. But what's happening right now in social networks is also so dangerous that we don't see, people have to decide whether they want Silicon Valley to decide what's going to be there on their platform based on engagement, based on hate, based on, whatever would be more provocative, or do they want their elected officials? So as a Democrat, although, democracy has its limits, and I don't trust those elected officials most of the time as a journalist, I would rather have, yes, these bureaucrats and elected officials than have, a programmer saying, yeah, as many responses and engagement as you get, and I don't care, which was basically, the policy of Facebook until 3.5 years ago. And I think we need to support that. We need our job as journalists would be to supervise and see if our governments are using this in a wrong way. But we need to basically push for this to happen right now, because if we don't, we're seeing this right now with the vaccine. Facebook is not answering the stuff what it said it would do. It's not doing. It's causing enormous amount of damage in a very specific window of time. And this damage will not be recoverable because there's a different strain right now because of other issues. And the same goes to hate speech. There are certain windows of time which are so essential. And if you don't act with them, like after Trump has been elected, then you get things that are happening really in reality. And this is why we do need governments to act. Because when they do act, we see that corporations back down.
Thank you, Nadav. Thank you. I see that we're running out of time, but I have two important questions. So one is going to you, Batya, and I want to talk to you about the discourse within the Jewish community. So how do we approach the extreme voices within our own community on Israel issues? So we spoke about the wide spectrum, but now let's talk about the margins. So on the radical left, I mean, those who claim to be an authentic Jewish voice but reject Israel's legitimacy. And then on the far right, those who will call almost any criticism of Israel, no matter how small, anti-Semitic. Are they worth engaging with? What's your view here?
So if you'll just permit me to disagree with something each of you has said, and then I'll answer very quickly. So as an American, I have to completely disagree with what Nadav just said. Like we have a First Amendment, and the minute you let the government start interfering in free speech, it's over, it's game over. And, you know, when I hear foreign governments saying, you know, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic and illegal, of course, there's a corner of my heart that feels warmed by that. But that corner must be stopped. Like that's what our founding fathers understood, that it's very important to allow people to express themselves freely. And Tomer, to your point, I loved your psychoanalytic definition of anti-Semitism. But to me, defining anti-Semitism based on what is in somebody's heart or unconscious is also extremely dangerous. I mean, I see the beauty of your construction, and you should definitely write an op-ed about that for the forward. But I think it's also very dangerous because anti-Semitism, again, it's not problematic because people hate Jews in their heart of hearts. That's their right. You know, like we shouldn't be policing thought. We're policing the public square. And so if we have to go into someone's heart and mind to find out if what they said is anti-Semitic, that's going to lead to a very dark place that I don't think we want to go to. And then Carol, just something you said about how Israel has its own interests. It's true. Israel has its own interests to defend, but its moral claim is that it is the defender of the Jews if things get really bad. And so the idea that Netanyahu should and does engage in things that put us in danger, I think is really problematic. All right, your question was what to do about the extremes. So to me, as an opinion editor, I think that our Jewish values and our democratic values depend very much on hearing from the full spectrum of legitimate opinion. And so the question becomes, where does that spectrum, how far does that spectrum go? That is the most important part of my job, is figuring out where those red lines are. A lot of Jews are upset because I think that anti-Zionism is within the legitimate spectrum, depending on what you use to justify it, right? So are you justifying your anti-Zionism because you think only the Jews should not have a state? That's probably anti-Semitic, and you probably should not be, you know, in the opinion pages of the forward. But if you are justifying it because you believe there should be no nation states, right? That is a justifiable position. If you are a Palestinian and your family has lost everything to the Nakba, that to me is a justifiable and very easy to separate from anti-Semitism position. And same thing holds on the right. You know, we run settlers who, you know, as long as they don't, you know, their fantasy of how things end is not that, you know, Palestinians never have civil rights. Like there is room for that in our discourse. And there's certainly room for people to argue the thing we all disagree on, which is that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. I mean, I think they're very wrong. And I am offended by that view, just like I'm offended by a lot of the views on the left that I run. But those to me are not where the limits are. The limits are things like racism or the permanent dispossession of a subaltern's, you know, civil rights. Do you believe that minorities should be treated equally or not? So those are sort of the red lines for me. And it's very much about how you express yourself and how you justify your position, much more so than the position itself, I would say.
Thank you very much, Batya. We have some other questions, and we have some questions from the audience. So let me just try to sum all of them up. One question that I want to ask you, Tomer, because it really relates to a sort of an Israeli discourse that I'm very concerned that we're having. So we at ADL believe that equating Israel Jews to the Nazis and the Nazi regime is crossing the line. It's also reflected in the IRA definition, but is the whole conversation mentioning Nazis or the Nazi era totally illegitimate? Can't the Holocaust be mentioned as something that arrived after a process of changing hearts and minds, something that we are trying to avoid? How do you see this whole discourse? And as I said, we're seeing it more and more in Israel, and it doesn't look very good. Please, Tomer.
Thanks, Carol. Well, you know, this comes back to what we said earlier. I mean, I think that a lot of times when we say comparing Israel to the Nazis is anti-Semitic, we're actually saying comparing Israel to the Nazis is illegitimate. right? I mean, this is shorthand for saying these sort of comparisons shouldn't be on the table. It's not even worth considering. It's just nonsense or abhorrent. But this topic is very hot right now in Israel. I mean, it's in the news and certainly in the Twitter feed a lot about how we should or should not, must or mustn't ever compare Israel to you know. And I think personally that any historical comparison can be valid. Again, it always depends on where it's coming from. It depends on how, you know, how much it makes even a little sense and not thrown into the arena as a sort of a wild card in order to stop the conversation even, or just to insult the other side. I think processes where societies slide towards fascism or towards racism are not unique to Germany. And if so, we can learn from the German example also about other societies. And if so, yes, it is informative to try to understand what happened there and to compare processes with other places. That being said, obviously this is used many times, especially, by the way, not in Israel, by international criticism towards Israel as a sort of, you know, as a sort of under the belt insult for trying to delegitimize the whole Zionist project, right? And here we have also definitions of colonialism and racism connected to Zionism, which again are not. You can also argue that intelligently, but usually they are argued unintelligently and really as a sort of conversation stopper and an insult.
Thank you very much, Tomer. And look, you've been watching us from far away right now, but as I just said, I want to really emphasize that we're seeing more and more in the Israeli political and social discourse, especially that of the protests that we're seeing here, a lot of Nazi analogies, Nazi comparisons, and obviously that's a question worldwide when we see these comparisons, but when you see it in Israel, I think, I mean, for me as Israeli, as a Jew, it's really striking. Batya, there was a question here for you. So is blaming Jews for Israel's actions considered anti-Semitic?
Great question, really important question. I think I would say more so than anti-Semitic, it's just straight up racist. So it's racist to take a person of a race or an ethnicity and to hold them responsible for the actions of another person who they are not related to, but just because they share that ethnicity, you must be responsible. That's a very textbook definition of racism. So I would say, like, beyond anti-Semitic, it's just racist against Jews. Like, it's just the most basic definition. And so it is terrible and people shouldn't do it. And when they do it, yeah, it's both anti-Semitic and racist.
And
Please,
can I intervene? And,
sure.
and I totally agree with Batya, and this is exactly what I tried to note before. It's, first of all, it's just racist and it's just a nonsensical generalization. It's just bias, right? Yeah. And if we want to also understand if it's anti-Semitic, we need a certain definition of anti-Semitism. And I offered my personal definition, and then I would say if there is a sort of movement towards Israel or Jewishness as a sort of a bane, a sort of a essential evil in the West that needs to be cleansed or eradicated, then you move over, from simply bias to anti-Semitism, right? And you can identify that.
Well, I would say that, Tomer, not only that, I think that there's a pretty problematic basis here. I mean, the notion of dual loyalty is anti-Semitic by nature. And I think that this is why it for us really crosses the line. But there's a question for you, Tomer, just because you're still in the academia. So the academia is often identified as the new battleground for manifestations of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel approach. Do you think the Jewish students are well equipped to handle the accusations and the harassment? What more can be done, and who's responsible for that?
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question. You know, first I want to say, I talked about something that happened in the Berkeley Student Council a year and a half ago, but I personally have not experienced any anti-Semitism on campus. Before the coronavirus, I came to campus with a little yarmulke on my head. Nothing. I experienced only goodwill and smiling faces. So let's, I don't want to give out an impression that really maybe is a bit more than it is. Having said that, yeah, I mean, is academia at the forefront of, I would say, leftist anti-Semitism? And of course, the Charlottesville neo-Nazis are not the majority in any way on campuses today. Yes, I mean, we need to acknowledge that there is in left-wing or radical left academia circles a certain type of anti-Semitism. It is not the classic Christian sort of anti-Semitism. It is a mutation of it, we might say, but it is a new anti-Semitism, and it is anti-Semitism in the way that it sees Jewishness and Judaism as an essential evil in the West that must be cleansed. Right? Now, are students equipped to handle it? I would say certainly not. I mean, certainly not. They also coming from Israel, where students are after the army service and about 20 or 21 years old, it's something completely different when seeing undergrads here, 19 years old, out of high school. Most of them haven't really formed their political worldview. They're not informed in any significant way. So obviously they are in a great disadvantage and certainly when trying to defend their stance or even understand their stance vis-a-vis professors who are much more skilled and educated than them.
Thank you, Tomer. Allow me just to respond to that question with what ADL is doing. So our approach to how we deal with it, for example, is first of all, education and not accusation. So when Rachel Baida, a candidate for a campus judiciary position, was questioned about her ability to be impartial because of her Judaism and support for Israel at the UCLA student government hearing, ADL spoke out publicly. But we also did a series of educational workshops with the UCLA student government on anti-Semitism and the line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. So that's one. And then ADL really believes in coalition building, creating constructive policies to counter sort of BDS on campus and so on. And most importantly, really creating a space for open conversations about Israel and the safe conversation where people really can say what they think, but in sort of a legitimate discourse. I'd like to thank you. We're ending our session. Thank you very much, Batya. Thank you very much, Tomer. Thank you, Nadav. I know he's still hearing us, but he's probably driving right now. So thank you very much. And I'd like to thank our participants. And last but not least, our dear partners, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Israel, for a fascinating series of webinars. And I personally learned so much. So thank you very much all.
Thank you for having me.